June 17, 1242, corresponding to Vav Tammuz, Erev, Shabbos, Kodesh, Parshas, Chukas, is a date on the Jewish calendar that is extraordinarily painful. It was the day that 24 cartload of Svarim, Sifrei Kodesh, the Shas, were burnt to a crisp in the city of Paris in France. But it wasn't just that it was 24 cartloads of Svarim. It wasn't just that it was somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000 books. Svarim. But they were all in manuscript form. This was well before the printing press, and thus each work and manuscript that was destroyed was years upon years of work. Incredible energy went into writing each of these manuscripts, and the destruction caused terrible disaster. The rabbinate of France, European Jewry, world Jewry was taken as a result of the utter destruction, and where would it leave French Jewry and European Jewry? And this was something that the Rabbanim in the city would have to deal with. But it didn't just happen out of nowhere, because several years ago it began. The great apostate, the well-known apostate, the Rasha Nicholas Donin, charged the Talmud with blasphemy against God, against the church, and against Christianity. And he told the king, King Pius IX, otherwise known as St. Louis, as well as others, that including in the Bible was terrible, terrible things that needed to be dealt with, and thus the Talmud was placed on trial. And the Rishonim, led by Rabbi Yechiel ben Paris, the Smak, Rav Moshe Mikutzi, were called upon to defend the Talmud in this disputation against Donin. And Donin had multiple charges against the Talmud. And the Smak and Rabbi Yechiel ben Paris defended the Talmud with incredible scholarship, fluency, and sensitivity and scholarship. But nonetheless, it was a foregone conclusion. The Pope and the king decided that the Talmud needed to be burnt, and thus several years later, on that very day, Vav Tammuz, Erev Shabbos Kodesh Parshas Chukas, June 17th, 1242, these 10,000 Svarim, the Shas, on that date were destroyed. But the reaction of the Rabbanim of the city, and the reaction of the Rabbanim in Europe, and those who actually were eyewitness to these events, had very, very different reactions in terms of how to deal with this tragedy, with this tzara, with this terrible incident which occurred. I'd like today to share with you three different approaches, responses, that the Gedolei Rishonim had to this tragedy. The first of which is the Maharam Rothenberg, the well-known Maharam, the Rebbe of the Rosh, one of the last of the Balei Tosfos. The Maharam was so pained by witnessing this event that he authored the well-known Kina, which we all recite annually on Tisha B'Av, Shali Srufa Be'esh. And you read the words of the Kina, you can feel the pain, the suffering, the tragedy, and the longing for better days. Listen to the words of Maharam Rothenberg toward the end of this Kina Mem Aleph. Vani kashakul v'golmud, nisharti levad mehem. I am left behind like someone bereft of all of his children. Kisoren berosh har migdolayich, utterly forlorn, so have I been left all alone. Elbash ve'eskas besak kili ma'od yakaru. Because I am in so pained, the clothes, and cover myself with sackcloth, because your martyrs are very precious to me and powerful. The Maharam continues to question, to wonder, bewildered why this had occurred, and prays and hopes for better days ahead. Thus, the Maharam's response to this tragedy was one of question, not pinning it upon a certain event, not even claiming to understand the reason for the tragedy. But the Maharam placed his heart, his soul, his mind, and authored a kina begging, praying for HaKadosh Baruch Hu and commemorating this terrible event. However, there's a very different approach. Rav Hillel Mivarona, the outstanding Talmud of Rabbeinu Yonah, penned a letter where he had a very different approach as to why this had occurred. And Rabbeinu Hillel Mivarona explained that he believed that it was based upon many Rishonim who were vehemently opposed to the Rambam's position in philosophy, specifically his Sefer Mada, and moreover his Sefer Moreh Nevuchim, his Guide to the Perplexed. His philosophical approach was something that was felt very strongly opposed by his Rebbe, Rabbeinu Yonah Migarodna. and therefore explains Reb Hillel Mivarona in a letter that I will read momentarily the reason for the burning of the Talmud, of the Svarim and the Sifrei Kodesh in the city of Paris, was as a result of the fact that many Jews opposed the Svarim of the Rambam and even burnt them in the very same place where the Svarim of the shuls of the city of Paris were burnt. Says Reb Hillel Mivarona in this letter, Vim Tishaleni, you'll ask me, Mi yodea she'osam gzeros hayab avon sreifas hamada ve'amora. How do I know that the reason for the burning of the Svarim in the city of Paris, the 24 cartloads, the 10,000 to 12,000 manuscripts, the reason for their destruction was as a result of the burning of the Svarim of the Rambam? Encha, says Rabbeinu Hillel Mivarona, I'll tell you why. It's not even 40 days. Miyom Sreifa Sifrei Rabbeinu, from the time that the Svarim of the Rambam were burnt. L'Sreifa Sifrei HaTalmud, from the time of the burning of the Svarim of the Rambam, the Moreh Nevuchim, and Sefer Hamada. Not even 40 days elapsed from the date June 17th, 1242, Vav Tammuz Erev Shabbos, Parshas Chukas. Uba also Malcolm, the exact same place. Nisrifu kol ha-svarim v'ha-perushim shemimtzu beParis. All the Svarim in Paris were burnt in the very same location. V'nisariv efer sifrei ha-Talmud be'efer sifrei hamada v'amora. And the ashes of the Svarim of the Rambam were intermingled with the Svarim in the city of Paris. The ashes of the Svarim of the Rambam were still there. V'Yehudim v'Goyim yodu alter, Jew and non-Jew alike in the city of Paris knew right away. Ki din shamayim haya was a heavenly decree. Maharam sholchu eshin, from heaven a fire was sent. Ki sholchu yad b'sifrei hakodesh, because they placed a hand and burnt the Svarim of the Rambam. Continues Reb Hillel Mivarona, Varav Rabbeinu Yonah Hagadol mi Barcelona, my Rebbe Rabbeinu Yonah from the city of Barcelona in Italy. Hayarosh v'Kotzin, he was at the head. Al kol osam haros hagedolos, against all those who opposed the Rambam. Asher nasu b'tzarfas vas namal levavo. Rabbeinu Yonah felt very pained as a result of what he did. V'kibel alav, accepted upon himself, laleches l'shtateach al kever Rabbeinu. He promised that he would go to beg forgiveness of the Rambam at his kever in the city of Tiberia. V'livchos al kvaro shiva yamim, and to fall on the grave of the Rambam for 7 days, that the Rambam should be mochel him. And continues Rav Hillel Mivarona, this is why this disaster happened. This is why this disaster occurred as a result of the way the Svarim of the Rambam were treated. It said, however, Rav Hillel Mivarona doesn't write it in this letter, that may be the reason. Rabbeinu Yonah wrote his famous work, Sharei Tshuva, that it was his form of doing tshuva as a result of his opposition to the Svarim of the Rambam. The Maharam had his approach. Rav Hillel Mivarona had his approach, and let me share with you a third approach as to the reaction of this tragedy. The Shulchan Aruch says in Hilchos Tainus, Siman Tuf Kuf Pei, a list of many dates on the Jewish calendar that one should fast. However, the Ramah and the Mechaber list certain dates, but the Magen Avram adds one more. And I quote, V'isa b'ksavim, it says in the Svarim and in the writings of the Arizal, Shiroi l'chol bar Yisrael livchol sal sreifas haTorah. It's appropriate for every Jew to cry about the burning of the Torah. Shemikoach zeh nimsar haTorah b'klipos hamakom yachzir lanu b'meher v'yameinu. We should cry about the destruction of the Svarim of the Talmud. HaKadosh Baruch Hu should return the Beis HaMikdash speedily in our days. Kasav Tanya, the Magen Avraham continues quoting the Tanya Rabbasi, an unknown author, somewhere in the 13th century, probably an abridged form of the Sefer Shibbolei Haleket. B'yom Hashishi Parshas Chukas, on the 6th day, Erev Shabbos of Parshas Chukas, this coming Friday, close to 800 years ago, Nagu Yechidim Lehesanos, there are certain individuals who have the custom to fast. Sheba'oso hayom nisrfu chaf kronos maleim svarim. On that day, 20 cartloads of svarim were destroyed. The Magen Avraham has 20, as you'll see momentarily. The Shibbolei Leket has 24, which is the classic understanding. Bitzorfas, in the city of France. V'lo kavu also bimei hachodesh. The day of the fast is not given a calendar date, but rather was given the date of Erev Shabbos Parshas Chukas. And continues the reason why, because Shemitoch Shelas Cholam the Rabbanim in the city of Tzfas asked of God via a dream, why did this occur? No dalem sheyom ha-parsha gorm. It's as a result of the day of the parsha that it occurred. That Erev Shabbos Parshas Chukas. Gzeira Satora Zos Chukas Satora. The parsha begins Zos Chukas Satora Umitargaminan. The Targum translate the Gzeira Oraisa. It's a decree of the Torah. It's a decree of heaven. And thus the Rabbanim of the city, through this heavenly dream, when they inquired as to why it occurred, they said it was a gzeira, it was a decree from heaven. And thus for posterity, that date, Erev Shabbos Parshas Chukas, would become a fast that certain individuals would accept upon themselves, not Vav Tammuz, but rather Erev Shabbos Parshas Chukas, the day that the burning of the Svarim of the Talmud took place. 24 cartloads, 10,000 manuscripts were destroyed. But if you take a look in the original source, in the Shibbolei Haleket, which is the source of the Sefer, Tanya Rabasi, he recounts the events as follows. Ubinyan Sreifa Sator Kasav Nizel Zecher, Al Mashiira Biyameinu Al Rov Avonosenu, Asher Gar Mulanu, V'nisufra Torah Selokeinu, the Torah B'Kadosh Baruch has been burnt. Biyom Shishi, on Friday, Parshas Vizos Chukas HaTorah Ke'esrim V'arba, 24 cartloads of Svarim, Sifrei HaTalmud, Halachos, Haggados, Nisrufu B'tzorfas. Kasher Shamanu Lishma Ozen, we heard about this, we understood what occurred. V'gan min harabanim shayusham, the rabbis who were there, who were eyewitness to this event. Shamanu sha'asu shelas chalam, they asked of HaKadosh Baruch Hu through a heavenly dream. Ladas, to understand him, gzeira hi meisabore, is this indeed a decree of heaven? V'heshiva lahem, the response they got, Vida Gzeira Oraisa. This is a heavenly decree, which is the Targum on the words, the three opening words of Parshas Hashavua Zos Chukas HaTorah. Uperusho Vida Biyom Vav, on the Friday, the sixth day, V'es Chukas HaTorah hi Gzeira. Umeoso Ayom Ve'elach, says the Shibbolei Haleket or Bechizkyo ben Avram Harofe. From that day onward, Kavu Hayechidim Aleim Lesanos V'Bechol Shana V'Shana. And from then on, individuals accepted upon themselves to fast every Friday, Erev Shabbos Parshas Chukas. V'lo Kavu L'mei Chodesh, they didn't give it a calendar date, but rather on Friday, because that was the day that it occurred, Yom HaParsha Gorem. So thus we see three very, very disparate approaches as to how to deal with this tragedy. The Maharam Rothenberg wrote a kina, didn't pin it to a certain reason, but expressed the pain and the suffering. Rav Hillel Verona explained that the basis for the destruction and the burning of the Svarim of the Talmud was as a result of the burning of the Svarim of the Rambam. And other Rabbanim of the city of Tzfas had a different approach to ask through a heavenly dream why it occurred, and thus they understood that it was a Gzeira min Hashamayim, a Gzeira Satorah, Zos Chukas Satorah, Vida Gzeira de Araisa, and thus the way that they commemorated this date was by establishing a fast. But this date continued to be a date that was really commented upon and commemorated by other Jewish communities, not just in Paris. In the early 1700s, one of the great Rabbanim, Reb Chaim Palagi, a Rav in Turkey, writes in his Sefer Moed L'Kol Chai, Ubireinu Izmir, in the city of Izmir in Turkey, Nahirna Mikan Havina Talia, I remember since I was a child, Dayukam Anoshim, there were certain individuals, Sochrim, business people, Shayunis Harim Lotses Afilu Lashuk Laskem Berev Shabbos Chukas. They wouldn't go out to work. They wouldn't engage in business and commerce and in travel the Friday of Erev Shabbos Parshas Chukas. Umashahayilem Lasos Berev Shabbos, and whatever they had to do on the Friday of Erev Shabbos Parshas Chukas, Hayosim Misakan B'Yom Chamisha, they would take care of it on Thursday, the day before. V'heinod hayom rabim nisharim, and today in the 1700s, the early 1700s, Reb Chaim Palagi writes, many shalolelech me'ir lekfar yom zeh, many don't travel all together on this day. But it wasn't just the Shibbolei Haleket, it wasn't just the Tanya Rabasi, it's quoted by the Mishnah Berurah, the Aruch HaShulchan, and other Sfarim. But you'll see as well the Ramchal, who lived in the late 1700s, the early 1800s, also recognized this date as a very significant one. And he writes that in his city, in Italy, he also suffered as a result of a terrible tragedy, burning of the Talmud, which took place in Italy during his lifetime. Shahayu bavonoseinu harabim me'ayin yatsu. How did this occur? Why did this happen? Ki ein davar bli shorish, there's no thing that occurs without a reason. And he writes, V'ha'emes, the truth for why the burning of the Svarim took place. Ki hagedel ezehu shu Yisrael me'nisin atzman al divrei Torah. Jews are required to kaviyachol kill themselves in the study of Torah. Zos haTorah odum ki yamus ba'ohel. The beginning of this week's Parshas Chukas and Chazal, Rashi quotes, mean that to say that a person should kill himself over the Torah, the study of the Torah. And therefore the Ramchal concludes V'ha'emes ki b'makomos elu, in the cities and in the areas in Italy. Hayu kitroge haTorah Yosef, there was a very strong indictment against those who were involved in the Torah study. Ki yoseh lo himisu atzmam, they weren't really working hard in their study of Torah. V'holchu achrei hanos olam, they were enjoying the pleasures. Ki kain b'chol Italia, this what was happening in Italy. And thus the Ramchal, similar to Reb Hillel Verona, explains that there's a basis and a reason for this tragedy, which occurred in his lifetime, in the cities that he lived in. And in Italy, specifically in the late 1700s and the early 1800s, says the Ramchal that we didn't work hard enough in Torah. When you don't work enough hard in Torah, Zos Chukas Torah is going to be the basis and the reason. And thus you see these very, very different approaches. The approach of the Maharam, the approach of Reb Hillel Verona, the approach of the Rabbanim of the city of Tzfas. But the common denominator is that the Torah is something that is so critically connected to each of us. Istakel be'araisa ubara alma. Kucha brichu v'Yisrael v'araisa charu. The Torah is one and we are one with it, and thus donin and apostates, and everybody understood throughout the years, throughout the decades and the centuries, that the Jew and the Torah intertwined and interconnected, and without the Torah, without Chazal, without Torah Shabbal Peh, we have nothing. And thus they tried to burn the Talmud, they tried to destroy the Sfarim and the Sifrei Kodesh, but at the end of the day, we bounced back. We came back, we wrote more, we studied more. And included in that was the Rishonim and the Achronim, and we built and we developed. And nothing can put us down, and a Jew who's dedicated to the Torah and to Torah study will continue. And that's not something that anybody's able to understand but us. So thus, as we find ourselves in the beginning of Chodesh Tammuz, we move from Vav Tammuz to Erev Shabbos Parshas Chukas as we prepare for the 3 weeks, beginning with Shavasar B'Tammuz, climax with Tisha B'Av. We're entering very difficult, painful, challenging weeks. But the goal of the Jew is to turn these weeks into inspiring days, to rebuild, to restart, to do tshuva, and to come closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The destruction to bring us to building, and the challenges to bring us to heightened places. May we be zocha to continue our strength in our study of the Torah. Zos Chukas HaTorah Adum Ki Yamus Ba'ohel. Let's continue to learn, to study, to connect ourselves to the way we shan, and that this day Vav Tammuz, Erev Shabbos Parshas Chukas, ultimately, like all fast days, many don't, of course, fast. It's not a commonly known fast, but it should turn to a day of sason and simcha, a day of happiness and joy. Be'ezus Hashem, the 3 weeks should be May Simcha V'Sason. Have a wonderful Shabbos.